The survey ship Windward Current drifted at the edge of a region of space that every pilot in the Concorde fleet had learned to avoid. The charts called it the Gray Line. No stars were marked past it. No trade routes crossed it. Old sailors on the trade lanes said that ships which flew too close to the Gray Line never came back, and that even the light from that direction looked wrong, thin and gray, like something the universe wanted to forget. Captain Yura Belsenik did not believe in old sailor stories. She was Veyron, a species known across the Concorde for careful thinking and cold patience, and she trusted instruments more than legends. Still, when her sensor officer called her to the bridge in the middle of the night cycle, she felt a small knot form in her stomach. "Report," she said, stepping onto the bridge. Her sensor officer, a young Osseck named Patoran, had his 4 eyes fixed on the main display. "Captain, we are picking up a signal from beyond the line. It is not natural. It has structure. It looks like a transponder code." Yura frowned. "That is not possible." "There is nothing past the Gray Line. That whole sector was wiped from the star charts 300 years ago." "I know, Captain, but it is there, and it is getting stronger." The Concorde itself was old, older than any single member species could remember on its own. It had formed thousands of years ago, when a handful of neighboring star systems agreed to stop fighting each other and instead share knowledge, trade, and protection. Over time, more species joined, some willingly, some after long wars finally taught them that peace was cheaper than conquest. By the time humanity was discovered, the Concorde stretched across hundreds of star systems, bound together by careful laws, slow committees, and a deep, almost instinctive fear of repeating the mistakes of its own violent past. That fear was the reason the Assembly listened so closely to voices like Ishtak Vaughn's. The Korath had survived their own ancient war, a war that still shaped how they saw every new, unfamiliar species the Concorde encountered. To many of them, caution was not simply a policy. It was survival itself, learned the hardest way possible. Yura had studied all of this in her training, the way every Concorde officer did. But history in a classroom was one thing. Standing on a bridge, staring at a signal that should not exist, coming from a system erased from every chart she had ever flown, was something else entirely. Yura ordered the ship to hold position and raise every shield they had. She had heard the whispers, the same as everyone in the fleet. Somewhere behind that gray wall of empty space, there had once been a system called Sol, a yellow star, a small blue-green world called Earth, and on that world, there had once been a species that the Concorde did not talk about anymore. The story, as far as any young officer knew it, was simple. 3 centuries ago, Concorde scouts found a new species on a world called Earth. That species was clever, fast-growing, and dangerously aggressive. They had already split their own world into warring nations, built weapons that could burn cities in seconds, and shown no interest in peace, even with each other. The Concorde Assembly, worried that such a species would one day turn its violence outward into the stars, voted to seal the system away. A quarantine fleet was sent to watch over Sol and make sure nothing ever left it. Then, one day, contact with that fleet stopped. The official record said that a strange stellar event, a rare kind of solar flare storm, had destroyed both the fleet and the system itself. Sol was marked dead. Earth was marked dead. The coordinates were removed from every star chart in Concorde space, and new pilots were simply told there was nothing there. A dead zone, nothing worth the fuel to visit. That was the story every child in the Concorde grew up with. Yura had heard it herself as a young cadet, told with a shrug, as if it were nothing more than a sad footnote in history. She had never once questioned it. Until tonight. "Put it on speaker," she said. The bridge crackled with static, and then a voice came through, calm and steady, speaking in old Concorde trade language, with an accent none of them had heard before. "Unknown vessel, this is the long-range scout ship Ohio Trail, Registry Sol System, United Earth Fleet. We have detected your presence at the edge of our patrol zone. Please respond and identify yourself." For a long moment, nobody on the bridge said anything at all. Kamptorin was the first to break the silence. "Captain, that signal came from inside the line. 300 years earlier, the story had begun very differently. and very few people left alive still remembered how it truly started. When Concorde scouts first found Earth, they did not land. They watched from orbit, cloaked and silent, for almost 2 full years. They watched humans fight wars over borders and resources. They watched humans build machines that could end a city in a flash of light. They watched humans argue in massive stone buildings about whether to trust each other at all. To Concorde eyes, trained to value order and slow, careful growth, humanity looked like a storm that had not yet decided which way to blow. The report that went back to the Concorde Assembly was blunt. Humanity was intelligent, fast learning, and deeply divided. If contacted openly, the report warned, humans might see the Concorde itself as just another rival power to fight. Worse, if humans were left alone to keep growing at their current pace, some analysts believed they could develop starflight capability within a few centuries, entering the wider galaxy already trained in total war. The Assembly debated for years. Some species argued for open contact and guidance, believing humanity could be taught peace, the way many other young species had been. Others argued for total isolation, cutting Earth off from any knowledge of the stars forever. But one voice, quiet and patient, argued for something else entirely. That voice belonged to a Korath elder named Ishtok Vaughn. The Korath were an old species, older than most in the Concorde, and they remembered a war from their own deep past, a war against another young species that had grown too fast and burned half their home region of space before being stopped. Ishtok Vaughn had grown up hearing stories of that war from his own grandparents. He looked at the reports on Earth and saw, he believed, the same pattern beginning again. His solution was simple and terrible. Seal Earth away completely, using a quarantine fleet to make sure nothing left the system. Watch it, study it from a safe distance, and if humanity ever became a real threat, be ready to end that threat quietly, before the rest of the galaxy ever had to know there had been a threat at all. The Assembly, tired and cautious, voted for a soft version of his plan. A quarantine, yes. Careful monitoring, yes. But no violence, unless the humans themselves attacked first. Ishtok Vaughn accepted the vote publicly. Privately, he began building something else. The quarantine fleet stationed at Sol was, on paper, a defensive force meant to watch and report. But over the decades, more and more of its officers were quietly replaced with Korath loyal to Ishtok Vaughn personally. By the time 40 years had passed, the fleet answered to him alone in all but name. What happened next was never fully recorded, because Ishtok Vaughn made sure of it. Humanity, in that time, had continued growing exactly the way the first survey report predicted. They had ended their worst wars. They had built a single unified government for their whole world, something the early reports had thought impossible. They had begun building their first true starships, clumsy and slow compared to Concorde technology, but real all the same. To Ishtok Vaughn, this was the final warning sign. A young species with a history of war, now unified, now building ships to leave its own system. In his mind, this was exactly how the old war of his ancestors had begun. He gave the order himself, without asking the Assembly. The quarantine fleet, over 300 ships strong, would enter Sol's system and destroy humanity's ability to ever leave it. Not annihilation of the species, he told his officers, just their ships, their shipyards, their space stations. A single, overwhelming strike to clip humanity's wings before they could ever fly. The fleet entered Sol's system, on what humans would later simply call the Dark Morning. What Ishtok Vaughn did not know, what none of the Concorde had ever bothered to learn in 300 years of quiet watching, was that humanity had spent that entire time building more than ships in orbit. Deep under mountains and oceans, hidden from every satellite and sensor the Concorde fleet had ever used, humanity had been building something else, something meant only for the worst possible day. The battle that followed lasted 11 hours. When it was over, the Concorde quarantine fleet did not exist anymore. Every one of its 300 ships had been destroyed, along with almost all of the officers loyal to Ishtok Vaughn. He himself survived only because he had stayed behind at a listening post outside the system, monitoring events from a safe distance, too cautious to lead the attack in person. He returned to Concorde space alone, in a single small ship, carrying a secret that could end his career, his reputation, and possibly start a war within the Concord itself, between species who wanted humanity destroyed and species who would be horrified to learn what had actually been done in their name. Down on Earth, in the days after the dark morning, humanity did not know why the attack had ended so suddenly, only that it had. Cities that had spent the night watching strange lights burn in the upper atmosphere woke to silence and to a sky finally empty of enemy ships. Governments that had spent centuries arguing over borders found themselves, for the first time in human history, facing a threat too large for any single nation to survive alone. Within a year, the old nations of Earth had folded themselves into a single body, the United Earth Coalition, built not out of idealism but out of simple necessity. There was no more time for old arguments about land or resources when the entire species had come within hours of extinction. Every shipyard, every laboratory, every mind capable of contributing to humanity's defense was pulled into a single, unified effort. The wreckage of the destroyed quarantine fleet became humanity's greatest teacher. Engineers who had once designed passenger aircraft found themselves studying alien fusion reactors. Physicists who had spent careers theorizing about gravity found working examples of gravity manipulation technology sitting in twisted metal on the ocean floor. It was slow, painstaking work, filled with failures and small breakthroughs, but it never stopped, not for one single day across 300 years. So he lied. He told the assembly that a massive solar storm, a once-in-a-thousand-year stellar event, had destroyed the quarantine fleet, along with the entire Sol system. He presented false sensor readings, carefully built over months using data twisted from old records. The assembly, having no reason to doubt one of its oldest and most respected members, accepted the story. Sol system was marked dead. Earth was marked dead. The coordinates were sealed and removed from public star charts, partly out of respect for the lost fleet, and partly, though nobody but Ishtok Vaughn knew this reason, so that no one would ever fly close enough to notice the lie. For 300 years, that lie held. Back aboard the Windward Current, Captain Yura Belsenik stared at the message still glowing on her display. United Earth Fleet. Words that should not exist. From a system that should not exist. Spoken by a species the entire galaxy believed had been dead for 3 centuries. Torin, she said slowly, confirm that transponder code. Cross-reference it with the old Concord archives before the Sol records were sealed. It took only a few seconds. The young Ossek's eyes widened. Captain, it matches. It is an old Concord format. Whoever built that ship's transponder system learned how from equipment left behind 300 years ago. Yura felt the knot in her stomach tighten into something closer to fear, and something else, something she had not expected. Curiosity. Open a channel, she said. Let's find out who is really out there. On the other end of that connection, aboard the Ohio Trail, a young human officer named Lieutenant Marcus Webb watched his own display light up with an incoming response. He had grown up hearing stories about the dark morning from his grandparents, stories about a sky full of enemy ships and a battle that saved humanity's future. He had grown up in a world that had spent 300 years quietly rebuilding, quietly growing stronger, always wondering if one day the people who tried to destroy them the first time would come back to finish the job. He had never expected that instead, humanity would be the one to go looking. Captain, he called out, we have a response. They want to talk. In the command chair behind him, Fleet Admiral Elena Cho allowed herself a small, tired smile. 300 years of isolation, 300 years of secrecy, of building, of preparing for a day that might never come. And now, finally, it had. Then let's talk, she said quietly. It's time the galaxy remembered we exist. Far away, in the heart of Concord space, an old Korath elder named Ishtok Vaughn was sitting quietly in his private chambers when an emergency alert reached his personal console. A single line of text, from a trusted contact still serving in fleet intelligence. Contact confirmed beyond the gray line. Source, Sol system, species, human. His hand trembled slightly as he read it. The lie he had built 300 years ago, the lie that had shaped the rest of his long life, was about to come apart, and somewhere out there, in the empty gray space that the galaxy had chosen to forget, Humanity was already on its way back. News does not travel quietly in the Concorde, no matter how hard someone tries to keep it quiet. Within a day of the Windward Current sending its report up the chain of command, whispers had already begun moving through fleet stations near the border. By the third day, the whispers had reached the capital world of Threnna Prime, home to the Concorde Assembly itself. By the fifth day, it was no longer a whisper. It was an emergency session. The assembly chamber on Threnna Prime was a massive open dome, built to host representatives from every member species of the Concorde. Hundreds of seats rose in circular rows around a central platform, each seat holding a different shape, a different color, a different way of breathing the air. Today, almost every seat was full, which almost never happened outside of a declared crisis. Counselor Vesa Thane, a Veyran diplomat known for her calm voice and sharp questions, stood at the central platform holding a data tablet with the full report from the border fleet. "Honored members," she began, "3 days ago, a Concorde survey vessel operating near sector designation Gray Line made contact with a ship identifying itself as belonging to the United Earth Fleet." The chamber erupted into noise immediately. Some species called out questions. Others simply made loud, confused sounds in their own languages. Vesa raised a hand, and slowly the noise settled. "I understand this is difficult to believe," she continued. "The Sol system was recorded as destroyed 300 years ago, along with our quarantine fleet stationed there. However, sensor data, transponder codes, and direct communication all confirm the same result. The species we call human is not extinct. It appears they have been alive and growing this entire time." From high in the chamber, an old Korath elder sat perfectly still, his long gray robes pooled around him like still water. Ishtak Vaughn had expected this day might come eventually. In some distant future he would not live to see. He had not expected it to come so soon, and he had certainly not expected to be sitting in this chamber, listening to his own 300-year-old lie begin quietly falling apart in front of the entire Concorde. He said nothing. He had learned patience a very long time ago. Vesa continued her report, laying out what little the Concorde actually knew. A single scout ship, a message in old-style trade language, but with strange new patterns mixed in, suggesting the humans had developed their own advances since the last recorded contact centuries ago. No sign of aggression. In fact, the human ship had simply held position, exchanged basic information, and then quietly returned toward the Gray Line, back into the space that no Concorde chart marked anymore. "What is being proposed?" asked a representative from the Thalmar, a warrior species who tended to prefer direct answers to long debates. "A formal survey mission," Vesa answered. "Small, unarmed, diplomatic in nature. We need real information before the Assembly can decide on any further action." The vote passed quickly. Nobody in that chamber wanted to be the one responsible for either starting a war with a species that had apparently survived alone for 3 centuries, or ignoring a genuine mystery sitting right at the edge of their space. A survey mission would go out. Diplomats, not soldiers, would make first contact. Even so, the debate leading up to that vote had revealed just how divided the Assembly truly was on the matter. A representative from the gentle, scholarly Yulari species argued passionately that humanity deserved a full and immediate apology, regardless of what the survey mission eventually found, simply based on the tragedy of losing an entire system's contact for 300 years. A blunt Thalmar warrior countered that sympathy was premature, that no one yet understood what kind of society had grown behind that sealed border, and that caution, not guilt, should guide the Concorde's first steps. Vesa herself had stayed carefully neutral through most of the debate, though privately she found herself troubled by a detail that kept surfacing in her mind. The original quarantine order, the one authorizing the fleet stationed at Sol, had always specified a purely defensive posture. Nothing in the Assembly's own historical records explained how a supposedly natural stellar event could have destroyed 300 ships without leaving behind the kind of debris field such an event should have created. It was a small inconsistency, one that had simply never been questioned in 300 years of nobody having any reason to look closely. Now, watching the Assembly vote to send a survey mission out to finally learn the truth, Vesa found herself wondering exactly how many other small inconsistencies were waiting to be uncovered. As the session ended and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Ishtok Van remained seated a moment longer than the others. His long life had taught him to recognize the early signs of a storm, long before anyone else in the room felt the wind change. This was one of those moments. He would need to act carefully, very carefully. Far beyond the gray line, in a system the Concord charts still refused to name, humanity had spent 300 years building a life that very few outsiders would ever recognize as the same species they had once studied from orbit. The Dark Morning, as humans called that battle, had changed everything, losing so many lives in a single day, against an enemy fleet that had appeared with no warning and no explanation, had done something that centuries of human history had never quite managed on its own. It had united the entire planet, truly united it, under a single government called the United Earth Coalition. There was no more separate countries fighting each other for resources or pride. There was one people, working toward one goal, making sure that if anyone ever came back to finish what the quarantine fleet had started, humanity would be ready. The wreckage of those 300 destroyed ships had scattered across near-Earth space, and engineers spent decades pulling every scrap of useful technology from the ruins. Human science, already growing quickly before the attack, exploded forward once real alien engineering was placed in front of it. Fusion power, gravity manipulation, shield technology far beyond anything humanity had built on its own. Piece by piece, human engineers reverse-engineered what they could, improved what they understood, and quietly built a fleet of their own. They did not rush to leave the system. For decades, Earth stayed hidden, watching the edges of Sol for any sign that the Concorde might return. Slowly, cautiously, they began sending small scout ships just past the edge of their system, gathering information about the wider galaxy without ever revealing themselves. Life on Earth during those centuries was not simply about building warships and waiting for an enemy. Schools taught children about the Dark Morning not as a call for hatred, but as a lesson in what could happen when fear went unchecked and unquestioned. Museums were built to honor the lives lost that day, filled not with images of alien monsters, but with quiet memorials asking future generations to remain both strong and fair. The United Earth Coalition, whatever military strength it built in secret, worked just as hard to build a society worth defending, one that valued cooperation over the old divisions that had once split the planet into constantly warring pieces. By the time Elena Cho was born, humanity had long since moved past simple survival. Earth's cities ran on clean fusion power, drawn from reverse-engineered alien technology. Space stations orbited every planet in the solar system, and small colonies had even taken root on Mars and several of Jupiter's moons. Humanity had grown, quietly and carefully, into exactly the kind of capable, unified civilization that Ishtok Van had always feared it would become, though for reasons far different from the ones he had once imagined. Admiral Elena Cho had grown up hearing about the Dark Morning from history lessons, not family stories, the way Lieutenant Marcus Webb had. She was younger than him by nearly a decade, born long after the worst of the rebuilding years, into a Earth that finally felt stable, finally felt safe. But safety, she had always believed, was something that had to be defended, not simply enjoyed. It had been her idea, 3 years earlier, to finally send a ship far enough to make real contact, not to attack, not even to reveal much, just to see who was out there, and to remind the wider galaxy, gently, that Earth still existed. Now, sitting in her office aboard Earth's newest flagship, the Sol Guardian, she reviewed the report from Marcus Webb's crew about their encounter with the Concorde survey vessel. The aliens had not attacked. They had not even seemed hostile, only shocked. That was, she thought, a good sign. A knock came at her door, and Marcus Webb stepped inside, still in his flight uniform. "Admiral," he said, "Coalition Command wants your recommendation. Do we make full contact, or do we pull back and stay hidden a while longer?" Elena looked at the star map on her wall, the one showing Sol system surrounded by a wide gray circle marking the edge of known Concorde space. For 300 years, that gray circle had meant safety through isolation. But isolation could not last forever. Not if humanity ever wanted to be more than a single hidden system, always waiting for a threat that might return one day. "We make contact," she said finally. "But we do it on our terms. We show them who we are, not what they expect us to be. No more hiding, no more waiting to be found." Marcus nodded slowly. "And if it goes wrong, if some of them still want us gone?" Elena's expression hardened slightly, though her voice stayed calm. "Then we'll remind them why the dark morning ended the way it did." The Concorde survey mission arrived at the edge of the Gray Line 2 weeks later, a single ship called the Quiet Envoy, carrying 6 diplomats, a small science team, and Captain Yura Belsenik as mission commander, chosen specifically because she had been the one to make first contact in the first place. They did not have to wait long. Within hours of arriving, 3 human ships appeared from the direction of Sol System, moving with a confidence that surprised the Concorde crew. These were not the clumsy, half-finished ships their old records described from 3 centuries ago. These were sleek, fast, clearly built with real skill and real understanding of the technology involved. "They're hailing us," Patorin reported from his station. Yura straightened in her chair. "Answer it." The face that appeared on her screen belonged to a human woman, with short dark hair and calm, steady eyes. "This is Admiral Elena Cho, of the United Earth Fleet," she said. "Welcome back to human space. I understand you have some questions for us." Yura felt that strange mixture of nervousness and curiosity return, stronger than before. "We do," she admitted. "On behalf of the Concorde Assembly, I would like to formally request a meeting between our peoples. We wish to understand what happened here 300 years ago, and to correct a very serious mistake in our historical records." There was a pause on the other end of the connection, just long enough to feel meaningful. "A mistake," Elena repeated slowly. "Is that what your people are calling it?" Yura hesitated. She did not yet know the full story, not the way Ishtok Van did, not the way humanity itself did, but something in Admiral Cho's tone told her that whatever had truly happened at Sol 300 years ago, it had been far more than a simple mistake. "I would like to hear your side of it," Yura said honestly. "All of it, whatever it is." Elena studied her for a long moment through the screen, as if weighing whether the Concorde truly deserved that answer after 3 centuries of silence. "Very well," she said finally. "Meet us at these coordinates. We'll bring our own delegation. It's time both our peoples learned the truth." As the connection ended, Yura sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle over the bridge. Whatever answers waited at those coordinates, she suspected they would change far more than just a few outdated star charts. Behind her, unnoticed by anyone in that quiet moment, a small automated message quietly left the ship's systems, sent through an old encrypted channel that only one person in all of Concorde space still had access to. A warning, meant for Ishtok Van alone, informing him that formal contact between humanity and the Concorde Assembly was about to begin. The old Korath elder, reading that message hours later in the privacy of his chambers, finally allowed himself a single, tired sigh. The truth was coming. All that remained now was deciding what he was willing to do to stop it. The meeting point was a neutral station called Kalis Reach, built decades ago at the border between Concorde territory and unclaimed space, meant for exactly this kind of careful, uncertain first meeting between strangers. It was a quiet place, usually visited only by traders and the occasional scientific expedition. Today, it was anything but quiet. Admiral Elena Cho arrived aboard the Sol Guardian, escorted by 2 smaller human ships, and found the station's docking bay already crowded with Concorde officials waiting to receive them. Councillor Vesa Thane stood at the front of the group, flanked by representatives from several other Concorde species, all curious, all careful not to show too much on their faces. Elena stepped off her ship first, followed closely by Marcus Webb and a small team of advisors. She was not in a military uniform this time, but in the formal dark blue coat of the United Earth Coalition, a symbol chosen carefully to show that this meeting was about diplomacy, not war. "Admiral Cho," Vesa said, stepping forward with a small bow of respect. "On behalf of the Concorde Assembly, thank you for agreeing to meet with us." As Elena walked through the station corridors toward the meeting hall, she noticed the curious stares of dozens of alien traders and travelers, none of whom had ever seen a human before in person. Some watched with open fascination, others with quiet wariness, and a few simply went about their business, too used to strange new faces from 100 different worlds to be surprised by one more. It struck her, walking through that crowded, noisy station, just how large and varied the galaxy truly was, and how small a single sealed system like Sol had been within it, hidden away for 3 centuries, while an entire universe of different peoples carried on without them. "Counselor Thane," Elena replied evenly, "I understand your people have questions about what happened at Sol 3 centuries ago." "We do," Vesa admitted. "Our official records state that your system was destroyed by a natural stellar event, along with the quarantine fleet stationed there." Clearly that record was incorrect. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. "It wasn't incorrect, Counselor. It was a lie, and I intend to tell you exactly whose lie it was." The formal talks began an hour later, in a private meeting hall aboard the station, away from public eyes. Representatives from a dozen Concord species sat around a long curved table, along with Elena, Marcus, and 2 other members of the human delegation. Vesa sat near the center, acting as lead mediator for the Concord side. Elena did not waste time with soft words. She laid out the full history as humanity understood it, starting from the earliest days after first contact, through the slow years of quiet observation, to the day the quarantine fleet entered Sol system without warning and attacked without provocation. She spoke of the battle that followed, the massive losses on both sides, and the 300 years humanity had spent afterward, always wondering if the attackers would return. The room stayed silent through most of it. A few representatives exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the story any of them had grown up believing. "You are telling us," said a Thalmar representative slowly, "that a Concord fleet attacked your world without assembly authorization, and then lied about it for 300 years? "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Elena said. "Do you have proof?" Vesa asked, not unkindly, but carefully, the way any good diplomat would. Elena nodded to Marcus, who placed a small data device on the table. "We recovered wreckage from over 200 of the ships that attacked us. Every one of them carries identification markers tracing back to a single command structure, all reporting to one officer. We've also recovered communication logs from that day, logs your own historical archives, if searched carefully enough, should still partially match." The device projected a series of records into the air above the table: ship registries, command codes, fragments of old communication logs. Several of the Concord representatives leaned forward, studying the data with growing unease. "These command codes," said a quiet, precise voice from the far end of the table, "belong to a Korath fleet division, one that has not existed, officially, for 300 years. Every head in the room turned toward the representative who had spoken, an old Korath scholar named Threnel Vass, who had been invited to the talk specifically for his deep knowledge of Concord military history. "You recognize this," Vesa said carefully. Threnel Vass studied the projected data a long moment before answering. "I recognize the pattern," he said slowly. "There were rumors, decades ago, whispers among historians, that the official record of the Sol incident did not fully match certain fragments of old fleet communication. I always assumed those rumors were simply mistakes in old, damaged records. I see now I was wrong to dismiss them so easily." "Who commanded that division?" Elena asked directly. Threnel Vass hesitated, glancing briefly toward Vesa before answering. "Elder Ishtok Von," he said quietly, "one of the most respected members of the current assembly." The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The Yulari representative, a tall, soft-spoken being with pale, luminous skin, finally broke it. "If this is true," she said slowly, "then the Concord itself owes humanity far more than an apology. We told every species in this assembly that Sol had been destroyed by nature. We taught it in our schools. We built memorials to a supposed tragedy that we ourselves caused, and then hid. We do not yet know the full truth," Vesa said carefully, though her own voice carried less certainty than usual. "But I agree. This cannot be ignored, or quietly buried, the way it apparently has been for 300 years. I will bring this evidence before the Assembly personally, and I will request a full, formal investigation." Elena watched the reactions around the table carefully, gauging which species seemed genuinely troubled by the revelation, and which seemed more concerned with protecting the Concord's reputation. It was, she thought, a useful thing to learn this early in humanity's return to galactic society. Not every species that claimed to value peace and fairness would necessarily act on those values when the truth proved inconvenient. News of what had been said in that private meeting hall did not stay private for long. Within a day, carefully worded reports had reached Concord news networks across the capital, and within 2 days, the name Ishtok Vaughn was being spoken in connection with the Sol incident in public for the first time in 300 years. Ishtok Vaughn himself remained calm through it all, at least outwardly. He had spent 3 centuries building a reputation as one of the wisest, most careful voices in Concord politics, and he was not about to let that reputation crumble simply because a few old ship registries had survived longer than he had planned for. He requested, and was granted, a private audience with Vesa Thane before any formal investigation could begin. "You wish to speak with me," Vesa said, meeting him in a quiet garden room, away from the busier parts of the assembly building. "I did," Ishtok Vaughn said, settling slowly into a chair across from her. "Vesa, I have known you since you were a young diplomat, still learning to find your voice in a room full of louder species. I respect you. That is why I want you to hear the truth from me directly, before the noise of politics twists it into something else." "Then tell me," Vesa said simply. Ishtok Vaughn folded his long hands together. "Everything I did to protect the Concord," he said. "The humans were dangerous. My own people's history taught me exactly how dangerous a young, aggressive species can become if left unchecked. I made a difficult choice, alone, because I believed the Assembly's caution would not act quickly enough to prevent a future disaster." "You attacked an entire world without authorization," Vesa said quietly. "And then you lied about it for 300 years. "Yes," he admitted, without flinching. "And I would remind you, Counselor, that humanity survived that attack. They did not simply survive, they grew stronger from it. Faster than any of our projections predicted. Does that not prove my original fear correct? A species capable of rebuilding an entire fleet's worth of destroyed technology, uniting their whole world in the process, all within 3 centuries. Vesa studied him carefully. "Or," she said slowly, "it proves that a species pushed into a corner, attacked without warning by an enemy they never provoked, will do whatever it takes to make sure it never happens again. That is not the story of a dangerous predator, Elder Vaughn. That is the story of survivors." Ishtok Vaughn's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, something colder. "Careful, Counselor," he said quietly. "You speak as though you already trust them completely. 3 centuries is a long time for a species like that to plan a very patient kind of revenge." "Is that truly your concern?" Vesa asked. "Or is it simply easier to keep believing they are the villains, rather than admit what you allowed to happen in your own name?" Ishtok Vaughn did not answer that. He simply rose, smoothed his long gray robes, and left the garden room without another word. That night, aboard the Sol Guardian, Elena Cho received an encrypted message flagged as urgent, sent through a private channel Marcus Webb had quietly set up with a sympathetic contact inside the Concord fleet, someone who had grown deeply uneasy after learning the truth about Ishtok Vaughn. She read it twice before calling Marcus into her office. "It's from our contact inside Concord Intelligence," she said, handing him the tablet. "Ishtok Vaughn has been quietly moving ships. Old loyalist crews, people who served under him during the original Sol attack and never fully retired from military life. Small numbers, spread across several systems, but the pattern is clear." Marcus scanned the message, his expression darkening. "He's building another strike force." "It looks that way," Elena said. "Small enough to stay hidden from the main Concord fleet, large enough to hit hard if he decides to act before the truth becomes fully public." "Do we warn the Assembly?" Marcus asked. Elena was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We warn Vesa Thane directly," she said finally. "She's shown us she's willing to hear hard truths. But we also prepare ourselves, Marcus. If Ishtok Vaughn is desperate enough to have attacked an entire world once already to protect his secret, I don't think 300 years have made him any less dangerous." Marcus nodded slowly, setting the tablet down. "Then I suppose the dark morning taught us the right lesson after all," he said quietly. "Always be ready, even when everyone around you insists there's nothing left to fear. Outside the viewport of Elena's office, the stars of Kalis Reach shone steady and calm, giving no hint of the storm quietly gathering just beyond the edge of what anyone at the peace talks could yet see. Vesa Thayan did not sleep much the night after Elena Cho's warning reached her. She sat alone in her office on Kalis Reach, staring at a star map showing the scattered systems where Ishtok Vaughn's old loyalist crews had reportedly gathered ships. Small numbers, spread out carefully, exactly the kind of pattern a patient old commander would use to avoid drawing attention. She believed the warning. She had seen the look in Ishtok Vaughn's eyes in the garden room, the coldness behind his calm words. A man who had once ordered an entire world attacked to protect a secret was not a man who would simply accept exposure and quietly retire. The question was what to do about it. Bringing the full Concord Assembly into an emergency session would take time filled with debate and procedure, while Ishtok Van's ships continued gathering. Acting without Assembly approval risked looking exactly like the kind of unauthorized decision that had caused this entire crisis in the first place. Vesa understood, with a heavy feeling in her chest, that there was no perfect answer here, only careful ones. She called for a private, urgent meeting the next morning, inviting only a small, trusted circle, Elena Cho and Marcus Webb from the human delegation, Threnel Vass, the old Korath scholar, who had first identified the fleet codes, and 2 Assembly representatives she trusted most, from the Thalmar and Osek delegations. "I believe the threat is real," Vesa said, once everyone had gathered. "But I also believe we cannot act against a respected Assembly elder without solid proof the entire Concord can see. Rumors and quiet intelligence reports will not be enough. Ishtok Vaughn has too much support built over 3 centuries. Then we need him to act first," Elena said quietly. "Or we need to force his hand before he's ready." Threnel Vass, who had been quietly reviewing old fleet records on his own tablet, looked up sharply. "There may be a way to do both," he said. "I have been searching the deep archives since our last meeting. Buried in an old maintenance log, one that survived only because it was misfiled under an unrelated engineering project, I found something. A partial list of officers who served under Ishtok Vaughn during the original Sol attack, cross-referenced with current fleet postings." He turned his tablet toward the group. "Several of these officers are still active. Several of them command ships currently listed as undergoing long-range patrol in systems that match the pattern of unusual activity your human intelligence has been tracking." Vesa studied the names carefully. If we can confirm even a few of these officers are secretly gathering forces under Ishtok Van's direct orders, that would be proof the full Assembly could not ignore. "Confirming it quietly will be difficult," the OSEC representative pointed out. "If we send Concord ships to investigate, word will reach Ishtok Vaughn long before we get real answers." Marcus Webb leaned forward. "Then don't send Concord ships," he said. "Send ours." The room went quiet for a moment. "Our scout ships are fast, and they're not registered on any Concord tracking system," Marcus continued. "Nobody in Ishtok Vaughn's network will recognize a human ship as a threat, because as far as most of the Concord still knows, we're a curiosity from a diplomatic meeting, not a military force capable of real reconnaissance." Elena considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "It's risky," she admitted, "but it might be exactly the advantage we need." Threnel Vass studied Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "You understand, Lieutenant, that if Ishtok Vaughn's loyalists discover a human ship investigating their hidden fleet, they may not hesitate to act, whatever the diplomatic consequences. A man willing to attack an entire world once to protect his secret is unlikely to show restraint a second time." "I understand the risk," Marcus said simply, "but my grandparents lived through the dark morning, not knowing why it happened, or whether it would happen again. I'd rather take the risk now, with clear eyes, than let another generation grow up under that same uncertainty." Vesa looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his calm determination something that reminded her, oddly, of the old stories the Concord told about its own early history, of small, uncertain civilizations choosing courage over safety in order to build something better for those who came after them. Vesa hesitated only briefly before agreeing. "Do it quietly," she said. "Gather what proof you can, and bring it back before anything else happens. I will do what I can here to keep the peace talks moving forward, and to keep Ishtok Van believing his secret is still safe a while longer." 2 days later, a small, unmarked human scout ship slipped quietly into the outer edge of a system called Vareth Hollow, one of the locations flagged in Threnel Vass's records. Piloted by Lieutenant Marcus Webb himself, with only a small crew aboard, the ship moved with careful, practiced stealth, using sensor technology built from decades of Earth's own careful engineering. The journey to Vareth Hollow took the better part of a day, spent mostly in tense silence as the small crew ran quiet diagnostic checks on their stealth systems, technology built from decades of careful refinement since the earliest days after the dark morning. Marcus used the quiet hours to review everything Threnel Vass had uncovered, memorizing officer names and ship designations, trying to build a clear picture in his mind of exactly what they might find waiting in the shadow of that gas giant. He thought, too, about the strange responsibility resting on his shoulders. For 300 years, humanity had existed as little more than a rumor and a sealed set of coordinates to the wider galaxy. Now, on this quiet, unremarkable scouting mission, he was about to gather the evidence that could either prevent a second attack on his homeworld or confirm that history truly was about to repeat itself. What they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. Hidden in the shadow of a large gas giant, shielded from normal Concord patrol routes, sat a fleet of nearly 60 ships, old designs, some clearly refitted and upgraded over the years, but unmistakably military in purpose. Marcus recognized the formation immediately. Disciplined, patient, exactly the kind of quiet buildup a commander would use who did not want to be noticed until it was far too late to stop him. "Confirmed," Marcus reported back through a secure channel once they had pulled safely away from the system. "Fleet strength approximately 60 ships, hidden and actively preparing for deployment. This isn't just a defensive precaution, this is an attack force." Back on Kalis Reach, Vesa received the report with a heavy heart. 60 ships was more than enough to strike a target quickly and decisively, especially if that target believed itself safe during an ongoing peace negotiation. "He's not planning to wait for the truth to come out on its own," she said quietly to the small group gathered once more in her office. "He's planning to silence it, permanently." "Silence how?" the Thalmar representative asked. Elena answered before Vesa could. "There's only one target that would truly end this threat for him," she said grimly. "Sol's system. If he destroys Earth itself, along with our delegation here, there's no one left to contradict his original story. No proof, no survivors to argue otherwise." The room fell into stunned silence. "He's willing to attack an entire world a second time," Threnel Vass said softly, "simply to protect a lie he told 300 years ago." "He's not protecting a lie anymore," Vesa said, her voice hardening with a kind of quiet anger few in the room had heard from her before. "He's protecting himself. Whatever fear once drove him to make that first terrible choice, I no longer believe that is what drives him now. Now, it is simply pride, and the refusal to ever be seen as wrong." Word of the hidden fleet reached Ishtok Van faster than anyone in Vesa's small circle expected. A single loyal officer among his old network, growing nervous after noticing unusual sensor activity near Vareth Hollow, had reported the human scout ship's presence directly to him, unaware that Ishtok Van's own secret was the very thing being investigated. Sitting alone in his private chambers reading the report, Ishtok Van understood immediately what it meant. His fleet had been found. His plan, carefully built over months of quiet preparation, was no longer as secret as he had believed. He had two choices now, and he knew it. Abandon the plan entirely, accept exposure, and face whatever judgment the Assembly decided to hand down after 300 years of hidden guilt, or act immediately, before Vesa Thayan or the humans could bring their proof before the full Assembly. He thought of his grandparents' stories, the old war that had shaped his entire worldview, the fear that had driven every decision he had made regarding humanity, since that very first survey report centuries ago. He thought of watching humanity rebuild faster than any species he had ever studied, uniting an entire world in the aftermath of tragedy, growing strong exactly the way he had always warned they would. Perhaps, he told himself quietly, this was simply proof he had been right all along. He gave the order that night. The hidden fleet at Verath Hollow would move immediately, not toward Sol System directly, which would take too long and risk detection along the way, but toward Kalis Reach itself, where the human delegation, along with key witnesses like Threnel Vass and Vesa Thain, remained gathered for ongoing peace talks. One decisive strike. Silence the witnesses, end the threat to his reputation, and, in his own mind, end the threat he still genuinely believed humanity represented to the wider galaxy. Vesa Thain received the emergency alert in the middle of the night cycle, jolted awake by the urgent tone of her personal comm device. "Counselor," came the voice of a station security officer. "Unidentified ships just dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. Sensors are reading over 60 vessels, moving directly toward the station." Vesa was already moving, pulling on her formal coat as she rushed toward the station's command center. "Sound a full alert," she ordered. "Contact the human delegation immediately and get a message to the full assembly. Tell them Ishtok Vaughn has made his move." Across the station, Elena Cho was already awake, roused by her own crew the moment the unidentified fleet had been detected. She stood at the viewport of her temporary quarters, watching distant lights growing slowly brighter against the dark backdrop of space. 60 ships closing in with clear and deadly intent. Marcus Webb arrived at her side moments later, already in uniform. "Admiral, our ships are ready. What are your orders?" Elena's eyes stayed fixed on those approaching lights, remembering every story she had ever heard about the dark morning, about a sky once filled with enemy ships, and a battle that had shaped everything humanity had become since. History, it seemed, was determined to repeat itself, whether anyone was ready for it or not. "Signal the fleet," she said quietly, her voice steady and calm, despite the storm rushing toward them. "Full defensive formation. Nobody fires first, but if he wants a fight, we will not be caught unprepared a second time." Outside, the 60 ships of Ishtok Vaughn's hidden fleet continued their approach, closing the distance toward Kalis Reach, toward the fragile peace talks, and toward a confrontation that would finally decide whether the galaxy's oldest lie could survive contact with the truth it had spent 300 years trying to bury. Kalis Reach came alive with alarms as Ishtok Vaughn's hidden fleet closed in from the darkness of open space. Station crews rushed to secure civilian areas. Concord security ships, few in number and mostly unarmed, scrambled to form what little defense they could manage on short notice. It was not enough, and everyone on that station knew it. 60 warships, built and crewed by officers still loyal to a 300-year-old secret, were not something a trading station's small security force could hope to stop. Aboard the Sol Guardian, Admiral Elena Cho stood at the center of her bridge, watching the enemy fleet's formation take shape on her main display. Beside her, Marcus Webb monitored weapons and shields, while the rest of the small human delegation fleet, only 12 ships in total, moved into position between the station and the approaching threat. 12 against 60, Marcus said quietly. "Those aren't good odds, Admiral." "They weren't good odds during the dark morning either," Elena replied, her eyes steady on the display. "We didn't win that fight because of numbers, Marcus. We won it because we were ready, and because we fought for something worth protecting. Nothing about that has changed today." She opened a channel to the rest of her small fleet. "This is Admiral Cho. I know the numbers look bad, I won't pretend otherwise, but every ship in this formation carries technology built from 300 years of hard-earned knowledge, technology paid for by every life lost on the dark morning. We are not the same species that fleet attacked 3 centuries ago. Today, we prove that. Hold formation, protect the station, protect the truth." On the incoming enemy flagship, Ishtok Vaughn watched the small human formation take shape between his fleet and Kalis Reach, with something between admiration and disbelief. 12 ships, standing firm against 60, without hesitation, without retreat. "They intend to fight," said his fleet commander beside him, a grizzled old Korath officer, who had served with him since the original Sol attack. "Of course they do," Ishtok Vaughn said quietly. "They always intended to fight. That is exactly what I have spent 300 years warning the Assembly about." Yet even as he said the words, some small, quiet part of him could not ignore what he was truly seeing. Not blind aggression, not chaotic violence, A disciplined, deliberate defense, chosen specifically to protect a neutral station full of civilians and diplomats, rather than retreat to save themselves. He pushed the thought aside. There was no room left for doubt now. "Signal the fleet," he ordered. "Begin the attack." The Battle of Kalis Reach began with a wave of long-range fire from Ishtok Von's fleet, aimed first at the human formation blocking their path to the station. Elena's ships responded immediately, shields absorbing the initial strikes while her own weapons returned fire with precise, coordinated bursts, aimed at disabling enemy engines and weapons systems, rather than destroying ships outright. "They're trying to disable us, not kill us," the enemy fleet commander said, watching the pattern of human fire with visible surprise. Ishtok Von frowned at his display. It was true. Ship after ship in his fleet found itself losing engine power or weapons capability. Crews left shaken but alive, rather than being destroyed outright the way his own ships were firing to kill. It was not weakness. He understood that immediately. It was restraint, deliberate and controlled, from a fleet that could clearly have chosen a far more destructive approach if it wanted to. Aboard the station, civilians and diplomats from a dozen species watched the battle unfold on emergency displays, many of them witnessing a human fleet in combat for the very first time. What they saw surprised almost everyone. There was no wild aggression, no reckless abandon in the human tactics, only calm, disciplined coordination, ships moving in tight, practiced formations, covering each other's blind spots, retreating, and advancing with a rhythm that spoke of countless hours of training, built over generations of careful preparation. Threnel Vass, watching from the station's command center beside Vesa Thane, found himself quietly reconsidering everything he thought he understood about the species his own people had once judged too dangerous to leave unchecked. "They fight like a species that has spent 300 years hoping they would never have to," he murmured. "Not like one that has been planning revenge." Vesa said nothing, but the same thought had already crossed her mind. The battle raged on for nearly an hour, human ships weaving through the larger enemy formation with a speed and precision that caught many of Ishtok Von's officers off guard. Slowly, steadily, more and more of his 60 ships found themselves disabled, drifting uselessly in the growing debris field, until barely 20 remained capable of continued fighting. Aboard the Soul Guardian, Elena watched the battle turn in their favor with grim determination, refusing to allow herself relief just yet. "Status report," she called out. "We've lost shields on 3 ships. Minor damage across the rest of the formation," Marcus reported. "No losses, Admiral. Enemy fleet down to roughly 20 operational ships." Just as Elena allowed herself the smallest breath of relief, new contacts began appearing on her display, a large formation approaching rapidly from the direction of Concord space itself. "Admiral," Marcus said, his voice tense. "New fleet incoming. Concord markings. Looks like the main assembly defense fleet." For a brief, tense moment, nobody aboard the Soul Guardian knew whether this new arrival meant salvation or a far greater danger than the one they had already survived. The new fleet, nearly 200 ships strong, moved swiftly into the system, positioning themselves not alongside Ishtok Von's remaining forces, but directly between his ships and the human formation. Weapons clearly aimed at the Loyalist fleet, rather than at Elena's ships. A channel opened on Elena's display, showing the calm, determined face of Vesa Thane, speaking now from the bridge of the lead assembly ship. "Admiral Cho," Vesa said, "my apologies for the delay. The moment your warning reached me, I brought the full truth before an emergency session of the assembly." It did not take long for them to authorize this response, once Threnel Vass presented everything we had gathered. Elena felt the tension in her shoulders finally begin to ease, just slightly. "Counselor Thane, I appreciate the timing." "Elder Ishtok Von," Vesa's voice carried now across an open channel, broadcasting to every remaining ship in his fleet. "By order of the full Concord Assembly, you are hereby relieved of all authority and ordered to stand down immediately. Your crimes against the human species, and against this Assembly's trust, will be formally answered for." Aboard his flagship, Ishtok Von stared at the overwhelming assembly fleet now surrounding what remained of his forces. His officers looked to him for orders, But for the first time in 300 years, the old Korath elder found himself with no plan left to give. He thought once more of his grandparents' stories, of the ancient war that had shaped his entire life's mission. He thought of the countless quiet decisions he had made in the name of protecting the Concord from a threat he had never truly allowed himself to question. And now, looking at the disciplined restraint humanity had shown, even while fighting for their lives, he understood, perhaps for the first time, how deeply wrong his fear had led him. "Stand down," he said quietly to his remaining officers. "It's over." In the weeks that followed, the full truth of the Soul incident was formally presented to the entire Concord Assembly. Ishtok Vaughn faced judgment, not from a secret tribunal, but from an open session, broadcast across every member world, exactly the kind of accountability he had spent 3 centuries avoiding. He did not deny what he had done. In the end, he simply said that he had genuinely believed he was protecting the galaxy from a dangerous future, and that watching humanity's quiet strength and discipline throughout this entire crisis had shown him, too late, how wrong that belief had truly been. The Assembly stripped him of all rank and title and sentenced him to permanent exile from Concord political life, a quiet end to a life that had shaped galactic history far more than anyone had ever realized. For Earth, the outcome was something far different. The Sol system's coordinates were restored to every Concord star chart, this time marked not as a dead zone to avoid, but as the home system of a species now formally recognized as full and equal members of the wider galactic community. Trade routes began opening slowly between human space and Concord territory. Scientists from a dozen species requested formal permission to study and learn from the incredible technological growth humanity had achieved during 3 centuries of careful, determined isolation. Admiral Elena Cho stood before the full assembly herself, several months after the battle at Kalis Reach, delivering a message that would be remembered for generations to come, both on Earth and across the wider galaxy. "For 300 years, she said, her voice calm and steady across the massive chamber, our world was erased from your maps, marked dead, forgotten by choice rather than by truth. We did not spend that time planning revenge, though I understand why some among you feared we might. We spent it building, learning, and preparing, so that if the day ever came when we needed to stand for ourselves again, we would be ready to do so with strength and with restraint." She paused, looking around the chamber at faces from a dozen different species, all listening closely. "Humanity is not the threat some of you were once told to fear," she continued. "But we are not a species that will ever again allow itself to be quietly erased either. We ask only for the same thing every species in this chamber values, a fair place among the stars, earned honestly, and respected fully." The chamber rose in a wave of applause and approval from dozens of different species, a sound Elena had never expected to hear directed at humanity, not after everything her people had endured. In the years that followed, historians across a dozen worlds would study the Sol incident and its resolution as one of the defining moments in modern Concord history, not simply because it revealed a terrible secret buried for 3 centuries, but because of how humanity chose to respond once the truth finally came to light. There was no demand for revenge against the Korath people as a whole, no push to punish an entire species for the choices of one fearful elder acting alone. Instead, Earth asked only for honesty going forward, and for a fair, equal place among the many peoples of the Concord. Young Concord officers, trained in the years after the incident, were taught a new lesson alongside the old stories of caution and old wars. They were taught that fear, left unquestioned for too long, could cause far greater harm than the threats it claimed to guard against, and that even the wisest, most respected voices could be wrong when patience curdled slowly into quiet, hidden cruelty. On Earth itself, the reopening of contact with the wider galaxy brought sweeping change. Students who had once studied only their own solar system now learned the histories of 100 different worlds. Scientists exchanged research with counterparts they had never dreamed of meeting. Slowly, carefully, humanity began stepping fully out from behind the shadow of the gray line, not as a hidden secret anymore, but as a full and permanent part of galactic life. Later that evening, standing beside Marcus Webb on the observation deck of the Sol Guardian, Watching the lights of Threna Prime spread out below them, Elena finally allowed herself a small, genuine smile. 300 years of being erased, she said quietly, and it only took a few months to be remembered properly. Marcus nodded, watching the distant stars with a quiet sense of pride. The galaxy deleted us once, he said. I don't think they'll be making that mistake again. Far above them, humanity's growing fleet moved steadily through the night sky, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten, finally taking its rightful place among the countless stars of a galaxy that had once tried, and failed, to make an entire world simply disappear.